Life would be simpler if we could handpick our neighbors, but for most of us, that's a luxury we don't have. You can either make peace with the people next door or resign yourself to misery every time you step outside. Oliver Lynch, a 79-year-old resident of Osceola, Florida, understood this better than most. For 25 years, he'd lived in the same house, watching neighbors come and go, always striving to build good relationships. But when a new resident moved in and staked a claim on part of his driveway, Oliver faced a challenge that tested his patience and his principles. Oliver was no stranger to change. Over the decades, he'd seen his quiet neighborhood evolve. When he first settled in Osceola, the lot next to his home was just an empty stretch of grass. He'd grown fond of the open space, enjoying the unobstructed view from his porch. Still, he wasn't opposed to a new neighbor, especially if they brought a friendly spirit. That hope faded when construction began. The rumble of machinery and the clatter of tools filled the air as a house took shape next door. Oliver watched with curiosity, wondering what kind of person would soon share his fence line. The answer came abruptly one afternoon. Returning home after a morning out, Oliver found a row of cinder blocks cemented along his driveway. The gray, unyielding line stretched from the street to the backyard fence, carving a clumsy boundary between his property and the newcomers. It wasn't just an eyesore. It shrank his driveway, leaving barely enough room to park his car. Worse, the blocks crossed onto his land, a clear overstep. Oliver stared in disbelief. Who would do this without so much as a conversation? The new neighbor, it turned out, was behind the barrier. A man of ambition, he'd arrived with big plans for his property and a questionable sense of entitlement. Oliver learned through the grapevine that the neighbor believed the driveway's edge belonged to him, a claim backed by some murky paperwork. To Oliver, it was nonsense. He'd lived there a quarter century without a single dispute over his property lines. Armed with his deed and county records, he confirmed what he already knew. The driveway was entirely his. Hoping to settle things amicably, Oliver approached his neighbor. He knocked on the door, deed in hand, and explained the situation calmly. "These blocks are on my land," he said, pointing to the documents. "Let's figure this out together." The neighbor barely glanced at the papers. "That's my driveway too," he replied, his tone firm. "The records I have say so." Stunned by the refusal to compromise, Oliver left, his frustration mounting. He'd expected a reasonable discussion, not a standoff. The next step seemed obvious: take the issue to the authorities. Oliver presented his evidence to Osceola County officials, confident they'd intervene. To his dismay, they shrugged. "It's a civil matter," they told him. "You'll need to handle it yourself or take it to court." The response felt like a betrayal. He owned the land, had the proof, yet the system refused to back him up. Left with no official support, Oliver faced a choice: let the block stay or fight for what was his. He chose to fight, but not with fists or lawsuits. Oliver had another idea: let the court of public opinion weigh in. He reached out to a local news outlet, sharing his story of a neighbor encroaching on his property and a county that wouldn't help. The reporter listened intently, sensing a tale that would resonate. Soon the headline hit: 79-year-old Osceola man battles neighbor over driveway. The article detailed the cinder blocks, Oliver's decades-long residency, and the standoff with the newcomer. It struck a chord. The story spread quickly, online, and through neighborhood chatter. Osceola residents rallied behind Oliver, outraged that a newcomer would disrupt their tight-knit community. "Who does this guy think he is?" one neighbor grumbled. Others saw it as a broader injustice. Why should a man who'd paid his dues for 25 years have to prove his rights? The pressure mounted on the new resident, who'd underestimated the power of local sentiment. Suddenly, he wasn't just facing Oliver, he was facing a united front. Days later, the neighbor knocked on Oliver's door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone softer than before. Oliver nodded, sensing a shift. The man admitted he'd acted on flawed information. "I thought that section was mine," he said, pulling out his own documents, surveys that contradicted Oliver's deed. It was a genuine mix-up, he claimed, not malice. Skeptical but willing to listen, Oliver laid out his records again. This time, the neighbor studied them closely. After a tense silence, he sighed. "Looks like you're right. I'll take the blocks down." True to his word, the neighbor hired workers to remove the cinder blocks. The cement cracked and crumbled, restoring Oliver's driveway to its full width. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. The ordeal had caught Oliver off guard. He'd left home one morning with a clear driveway and returned to a mess. Now, thanks to his persistence, it was his again. Better still, the resolution opened a door. The neighbor, humbled by the experience, apologized. "I didn't mean to start off like this," he said. "Can we try being neighbors instead?" Oliver agreed. After all, they'd be living side by side. The two shook hands, a tentative step toward friendship. The community, following the saga, cheered the outcome. Oliver had reclaimed his property and turned an adversary into an ally. It wasn't the quiet neighbor he'd hoped for, but it was a start. Reflecting on the dispute, Oliver saw echoes of a larger struggle. Like a character in a Kafka novel, he'd battled an indifferent bureaucracy and a stubborn opponent, armed only with his resolve. The county's refusal to act had forced him to get creative, and public pressure had tipped the scales. It wasn't just about a few yards of concrete. It was about standing up for what's yours when no one else will. The neighbor, it turned out, was a minister, a detail that surfaced late in the saga. Some found it ironic. A man preaching goodwill had sparked a feud with cinder blocks. Yet he'd owned his mistake, and that counted for something. Removing the barrier was his first step toward fitting into Osceola, a community that valued accountability. Oliver could have let the block stay, avoiding the hassle. But after 25 years in his home, he knew his rights and his worth. He'd stayed calm, sidestepping anger for strategy. The media amplified his voice, but it was his dignity that sealed the deal. At 79, he proved age doesn't dim determination. Neighborhoods are unpredictable. Some neighbors become friends, others stay strangers. Disputes, big or small, test how we handle conflict. Oliver's story resonated because it was about more than a driveway. It was about perseverance against the odds. He didn't just win back his property. He showed that standing your ground with patience and principle can turn even a nightmare neighbor into something better. As the dust settled, Oliver sat on his porch, the grassland replaced by a house, the cinder blocks gone. The view had changed, but his place in Osceola hadn't. He'd fought for it, and that made all the difference.